While I appreciate his erudition in economics and I'm learning quite a lot from him, he hasn't answered Ms. Tin's question.
As an accountant with over 3 decades of experience, I can tell you that is how people start getting into trouble. I hope you're not teaching that in your classes.
We have a form of minimum wage policy via the progressive wage model. Yet, until recently, we had deemed it unwise to make it universal and still dress the policy with so many additional conditions that the incentives for upskilling turn into loopholes that employers use to retain workers on the lowest rung of wages. We warn against unaffordable costs and lost jobs, despite evidence that the majority of Singaporeans would be willing to pay more for essential services, and that the employment impact of a minimum wage is likely to be very limited.
I'm not sure I heard correctly. Mr. James Lim seemed to have suggested that the implementation of minimum wage can be implemented with minimal impact on unemployment. I beg to differ. I think under current times, where businesses are being challenged and we're in a period of recession, there is a very real risk that if we were to introduce minimum wage, a universal minimum wage across all sectors, I think many of our lower wage workers may lose their jobs. And from low wage, they become no wage.
So there's no doubt that at this very moment, such a policy may not be ideal, but let us come together and agree that this is a principle that we want to roll out, so that when we set these plans in place, after the storm has passed, we can easily bring them to pass.
A key difference between PWM and minimum wage in that it is differentiated across sectors. And the fact that there is a ladder also tells us that there is recognition that we want to bring workers to different productive levels too, to make sure that workers continue to upgrade, they get paid better. And we have seen the impact of the PWM models where in the last 5 years, our low-wage workers have seen wages rise by 30% in real terms.
I don't want to get too technical, but there is a theorem in public policy making that when you are unable to hit your first best policy, it is very likely that your second best policy is going to be extremely different from the original. So you want to be careful when you try to over-engineer and try to squeeze out every bit of efficiency when you're working with imperfect knowledge about conditions on the ground.
I have 2 clarifications for the member. First, what is the level of minimum wage that the member proposes is appropriate for Singapore? Is the member aware of any countries with a minimum wage that have a lower unemployment rate than Singapore? Because I think that'll be a good case study for us. Thank you.
I should be clear. I do not know, and that is exactly why what we need is a national commission to understand this and to study this. Now, as for countries with different levels of unemployment, I think it's imperative for me to clarify that we don't want to be comparing raw unemployment rates across countries willy-nilly. But studies within the economics profession have repeatedly shown that in almost every instance, the unemployment impact is either very minimal or statistically insignificant, such that it cannot be detected in a regular statistical test.
Can I also confirm that by his response, he meant that the minimum wage can be implemented after the crisis, and then should a crisis hit again, it should be withdrawn, and then implement again when it's in a good time, and so on and so forth. And by that, how might it be more efficient? Perhaps to give us a better idea is that for your town council, what is the minimum wage given to your cleaners? I think that would give us some form of reference.
Whether we want to roll in and out of the minimum wage. In fact, I would argue the complete opposite. The whole point of something like a minimum wage is to provide that kind of social safety net. If you were to roll out the minimum wage at the time when you are in a crisis, that would pull the rugs out from under those workers that rely on the minimum wage in time of crisis. In terms of the town council, well, as you know, we are in the process of taking over the town council, so we have not made decisions on the minimum wage for the town council.
Does the MOS believe that there is no room for policy improvement for this group? Should this group wait until the progressive wage model comes to them? How long will that take? How many years will that take? And I would like to ask MOS Khan, would she consider that actually the danger to jobs is not setting a minimum wage, but setting a minimum wage too high, which is definitely not what we are advocating. And my third clarification is to Mr. Vikram Nair. I'd like to ask Mr. Nair, would he acknowledge that other countries who have higher unemployment than Singapore, it may not be causally because they have a minimum wage, and if we have low unemployment than those countries, it may not causally be that it is because we do not have a minimum wage.
The PWM model is a minimum wage plus, and it is a sectoral approach. And the sectoral approach actually has a lot to commend it because it allows you to set the minimum rung at a level that is not so low and not so high. Because if you have a single level, you'll have to decide where to pitch it. Raising the standard of living of the poor is a complicated matter. And I say this, by the way, as an economist, as someone who studies overseas experience very carefully, and who, together with my colleagues, is a practitioner. How do we do it without losing that wage earner's ability to have the pride of having a job and earning a wage? We do it through the progressive wage model, which has to be expanded. We do it through workfare. We do it through a range of other subsidies, whether it's KIFAS, the housing subsidies, and many other ways. And it's not a job that's done for good. We have to do more.